Top story this hour, oil prices seem to be climbing after major producers have reportedly agreed on deeper cuts to output to bolster prices as worries intensify over the fast-spreading coronavirus. During midday trading, Brent crude futures were up by 0.3%, $51 a barrel. Seems like OPEC agreed to cut output by an extra 1.5 million barrels a day, upper end of the spectrum there that was reported in the second quarter of 2020, but made it conditional on Russia joining the pact. Russia, however, has so far indicated that it would back an extension rather than deeper production cuts. On this development, among other things, we're going to be speaking with an analyst from Afrinvest, Babajide Atolagbe, who is with me in the studio today. Babajide, you're welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you, and good to have you. So, look, I mean, initially it was 600,000 barrel per day cuts. That was initially talked about, and at that time Russia said they weren't going to do it. Then it was speculated that it would be 1 million. And even myself, we were talking with our Rise business correspondent, Adifemi Akinsanya, earlier today, thinking that 1 million was too high. And now we're hearing 1.5. I mean, what's your take on that? That seems really, that's on the high end, way more than that was expected.
Yeah, so just yesterday we saw a report around the oil production cut. Although it's a proposal from Saudi Arabia on leading on OPEC countries. However, we expect the proposal to be, to be agreed. And we expect it is still subject to approval from non-OPEC countries, which is actually led by Russia. The reason why we're seeing the high numbers as high as 1.5 million barrels per day, we believe it's on the back of Saudi Arabia, who has always expressed its willingness to cut production in order to sustain price levels, like it did sometimes in 2019, when it actually voluntarily cut production by 400,000 barrels per day to sustain price during the heat of the trade war. So, however, we expect this proposal to be reviewed downward, given the fact that Russia is actually on the other end and does not really subscribe to cuts in production, not even a deep one like 1.5 million. We expect to see the proposal reviewed downward to around probably 600 to 800,000 barrels per day. Also, we will not be surprised if we start to see voluntary cut in production from OPEC countries, because they are the major agitators, major pushers for production in that space.
Well, okay, so if you look at somewhere like us, Nigeria now, well, what about that, walking that fine line between, between the suggestion and, I think revenue has to walk in there so at some point. So what about that balance between the two?
Yeah, for a country like Nigeria, over the years we've been agitating for an expansion in our oil production base, and probably in a bid to intensify or boost our our oil sector. And now that we might be asked to to comply with OPEC's rule, we might actually see a production cut, and that would actually take a negative beat on our oil sector. And that would also lead to, it will obviously have a negative impact on our GDP numbers, because oil sector contributes largely to the GDP. So in terms of revenue as well, if we see oil production cut on the part of Nigeria, and we don't see a proportional rise in price of oil, it might yield to a loss of revenue for the government. And in that case, it's seriously going to affect our fiscal space. We're going to see the government not being able to fund the 2020 budget or whatever year it is, and we might begin to see them. The government might begin to tap into the debt market just to to fill the patches in the budget. And we've been crying over the years that it's quite our debt levels is
high,
sustainable.
Right.
So that kind of impact is what we might see if prices don't respond to oil cut production.
What about the possibility of being exempt, where OPEC says, okay, Nigeria, I know you have issues, so it's not even Nigeria, some other countries as well. I know you have some issues, revenue issues, and so on and so forth. You guys don't have to comply. But I mean, if this ends up being the figure that ends up being set in stone, because the meeting is still going on tomorrow. Yeah, so it's today and tomorrow. If that still sticks, I mean, is it possible that we can be exempt, or how do you see things?
So at the end of the day, it depends on diplomacy and concessions, which I hope you understand. Each country sends their delegates to the meeting, to the OPEC meeting, to discuss what's it called, the cut production in order to sustain price levels. So if Nigeria is able to get an exemption, which I doubt is possible, because it's a union. We're all expected to, to follow the dictate of the union. If Nigeria is able to get an exemption, it's going to be good for us because, we'll still be producing at the same level, or albeit it might even increase our production level. And given the fact that oil cut in production may actually support price level in the short term, mid-term, it's a good one for us. It's a good one for us. However, it is also important to note that as at this moment, the major challenge we're facing globally is not necessarily a function of demand and supply. Although, yes, the coronavirus outbreak has weakened demand on the broader sense, but I feel cutting production at that level might actually not be the right answer. It might not be a long-term approach in tackling the issue because, fine, you cut production, this is going to have a positive impact on price in the short term, fine. What about the mid-term? What about the long term? What if the virus outbreaks still around the next 3-6 months? Are we going to be expecting another oil production of about probably 1.5 million or even 2 million barrels per day?
Yes.
So we're looking at it's not necessarily sustainable. I think much effort should be placed at tackling the virus, containing the virus, and making sure the associated parties recover from the effect of the coronavirus.
So and this is now where you start to get into the worries of the impact on the global GDP and all the players, because a number of bodies have come out to say, look, they are revising their outputs for. So if this extends, I'm glad you pointed that out. You mentioned you were just speculating 3 to 6 months. We're in March now. If this thing goes through to the end of 2020, then, I mean, what's the worst case scenario? I mean, we're looking at growth being cut for a number of countries, possibly chances of recession. What about that?
Well, I think
global recession, that is. Yeah.
Yeah, for global recession, it's still quite early to make a calling on that end because it takes a lot of factors, a lot of economics, before we can actually have a recession. Although we do not necessarily, it's not something we should just overlook because given the fact in 2019 we saw the trade war was the major hindrance of growth, and we saw how that negatively affected global growth. And now moving into 2020 with a form of optimism, given the fact that the trade war has been resolved, and the first part of the trade war has been settled, we expected a better 2020 in terms of global GDP growth. And now just about a few months into 2020, February, we already have the outbreak of coronavirus, which is actually affecting economic activities, starting from China. China is the largest consumer of so many commodities in terms of manufacturing, energy, and the likes. So we've also seen the virus spreading across other important countries. At least I doubt if there's any country that has not actually recorded a case at this moment, because the virus is actually spreading at a very fast rate. So if that should continue into the end of the year, which we hope doesn't
happen, right?
What we might see is it might have a very, very deteriorating impact on global growth because it's going to affect the manufacturing sector. We won't have in the industrialization process will be slow in the developed economies. It's really going to have a telling on the transportation sector, the energy sector, as well as the tourism sector, because as at the moment, people are just staying under their roofs. Nobody wants to travel. Nobody wants to visit another country, simply because of the fear we're having now. So those are all the things you need to look at before we downgrade the forecast. Although we've seen IMF started downgrading the forecast for key countries, even Nigeria.
Right, yeah,
Nigeria, because a lot of countries are dependent on, take for example, the emerging economies. They are dependent on the prices of of global commodities, and the coronavirus is actually affecting the prices of these commodities, which is actually affecting, although we might not see the impact now, because the full impact of the virus on oil price might not be felt now, because most of the contracts has been done
from prior.
Yeah, thank you. So going to the next 3-6 months, we begin to see the impact. Oil price was as low as $50 per barrel, which is actually very, very worrisome for major countries. The benchmark for oil price is around 55, some 60, some are even as optimistic as 65. So if you see a decline, if we're going to see a decline in in oil prices, not even oil prices alone, we have other commodities like copper. Take, for example, Zambia. Now, Zambia depends largely on copper, and copper price today has fallen about 15% thereabout.
Wow.
And see how it simply tells you that the government revenue base has actually declined 15% because they are copper exporting a country.
Right.
So a lot of countries like that are dependent on global commodities, and it's really affecting. And if it should continue at this pace, I probably we might see a global recession coming very soon.
That would be,
but not in 2020.
That would be shocking stuff. Very quickly, we've only got a couple minutes left. What are you seeing on your radar in the consumer goods space? I believe you cover consumer goods here in the Nigerian space. What's the latest there? What's happening in consumer goods?
So the rhetorics or the headline in the consumer goods sector in 2020 has still been the same, what we had in 2019. And a lot of companies in that space are actually, probably they're trying to get their heads above water. And the major factors that is affecting companies in that space is our weak macroeconomic environment. Okay. We have weak consumer spending. We have a lot of factors from the demand side. Right. All of those things are affecting consumer goods sector basically. Also, we have high cost of production. Most of these companies are incurring high costs. So basically, all those factors are still
affecting consumer goods. Yeah. Babajide Atolagbe, thank you so much for joining us.